Hey friends, tonight we are stepping back, way, way back, to a world that existed roughly 3 million years ago, during a period geologists call the Pliocene epoch. And before you get too comfortable with that idea, let me paint you a quick picture. The sky looks blue. There are trees. There is grass. There are birds. For about 30 seconds, you might think you have accidentally wandered into a nature documentary filmed somewhere in East Africa. Warm breeze, golden light, distant hills. Not so bad, right? And then you notice the silence where familiar sounds should be. No distant traffic, no airplane overhead, no hum of anything electrical. Just wind, insects, and something very large moving through tall grass about 200 meters away. Your modern brain, bless its over-caffeinated heart, would begin to panic almost immediately. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling me where you are in the world tonight and what time it is as you listen. I always love knowing who is out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing on the eastern edge of what will one day be called Africa, though that name is still approximately 3 million years away from being invented. The ground beneath your feet is dry, cracked at the edges of a shallow depression that might, after rain, become a temporary lake. The soil is reddish-brown, mineral-rich, and absolutely crawling with organisms your immune system has never encountered. You don't know that yet. You are still looking at the view, and the view is genuinely remarkable. The landscape here in the Pliocene is often described by paleontologists as a mosaic, a patchwork of open grassland, scattered acacia woodland, and riverine forest threading along the low ground where water runs seasonal courses. It is not the unbroken savanna you might picture from modern wildlife films. It is more varied than that, more textured, and in a way that matters enormously for survival, more unpredictable. You cannot see far in every direction. The terrain folds and rises. There are places where the grass stands taller than your head. The temperature right now, in what feels like late morning, is somewhere around 28 degrees Celsius, or about 82 degrees Fahrenheit. That sounds manageable. It even sounds pleasant, depending on where you are from. But the Pliocene was not uniformly warm, and scientists continue to debate the precise regional climate variations across this epoch, particularly how dramatically temperatures shifted between seasons and between years. What most researchers do agree on is that the overall global climate during the Pliocene was several degrees warmer than today, on average, and more importantly, it was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the planet was beginning a long cooling trend that would eventually lead to the ice ages. You are living in the last chapter of relative warmth, though you have absolutely no way of knowing that. Here is something that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The Pliocene Earth had a sea level somewhere between 15 and 25 meters, higher than today. Coastlines were different. Land bridges that matter enormously to later human migration did not yet exist in their eventual form. The world's geography was recognizable but shifted, like a familiar painting that someone has moved all the furniture in. If you had a modern map in your hand right now, you would be able to orient yourself roughly, but the details would keep betraying you. There are no modern humans here. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Homo sapiens will not appear for another 2.5 million years or so. What does walk this landscape are our distant relatives, primarily Australopithecus afarensis in some regions, and several other hominin species, depending on exactly where and when you have landed. They are bipedal, intelligent in ways that are easy to underestimate, and deeply adapted to a world you have only ever read about. You, meanwhile, are standing here in your 21st century body, with your 21st century assumptions, staring at a landscape that is beautiful and indifferent and almost entirely uninterested in your continued survival. The large shape in the grass has stopped moving. You cannot tell what it is from here. That uncertainty, that low, quiet tension in your chest, that feeling is going to become very familiar over the next several hours, assuming you last that long. And that, as it turns out, is genuinely the question. You take a deep breath. It seems like the natural thing to do. You have just arrived somewhere new. The scenery is dramatic, and your nervous system is already running a few background processes labeled things like threat assessment and where is the nearest exit. So you breathe, and for a moment, the air actually smells extraordinary, clean in a way that modern air simply is not, rich with grass and soil and something faintly floral, drifting in from a stand of trees, maybe 100 meters to your left. Your lungs, accustomed to filtered interiors and urban particulates, take a moment to simply enjoy this. That enjoyment will be brief. The air of the Pliocene, while technically breathable, oxygen levels were not dramatically different from today, was carrying things your respiratory system has never encountered in its entire life. Pollen, first of all, in quantities and varieties that would make your average hay fever sufferer weep quietly into their antihistamines. The plant communities of 3 million years ago were not identical to modern ones. Grass species, tree species, flowering plants, all subtly different at the genetic and biochemical level, producing proteins your immune system has no established opinion about. Some of those pollens it would ignore. Others it might decide, somewhat aggressively, to treat as enemy combatants. But pollen is honestly the least of your airborne concerns. The soil of the Pliocene was teeming with microbial life. Fungi, bacteria, ancient strains of organisms that have since evolved into something else entirely, or simply vanished from the record. When wind moved across dry ground, and in the semi-arid mosaic landscape you are currently standing in, wind moved across dry ground constantly. It lifted particles into the air. Microscopic particles, the kind you inhale without noticing. Your modern immune system, shaped by exposure to a very specific catalog of modern pathogens, would be encountering genuinely novel challenges with essentially every breath taken close to disturbed Earth. Scientists still debate the precise composition of ancient soil microbiomes and how dramatically they differed from their modern counterparts, particularly in regions that have undergone significant ecological transformation over the intervening millions of years. What researchers have established is that the relationship between early hominins and their microbial environment was extraordinarily intimate. They were shaped by it over millions of years of coevolution. You have not had that benefit. You arrived this morning. Now consider the temperature, because the air is not just a chemical environment, it is a thermal one. That pleasant 28 degrees you registered earlier was the late morning reading in open ground. By early afternoon, in direct sun, with minimal shade and the reflective heat rising off pale soil, the effective temperature your body experiences could climb significantly higher. Hominins of this era, including your Australopithecus neighbors, had adaptations for exactly this. Body proportions suited to heat dissipation, the beginnings of efficient sweating, a relationship with shade and rest cycles built over generations. You have a t-shirt and the vague memory that you should drink water regularly. Here is the surprisingly interesting part of the heat problem. One of the more compelling theories in paleoanthropology suggests that early hominins may have had a significant competitive advantage over large predators, specifically because of their ability to sweat efficiently and remain active during the hottest part of the day, when most big cats and other carnivores were resting in shade. Persistence hunting, the strategy of simply following prey at a steady pace until the animal overheats and collapses, may have been one of the earliest and most effective human hunting strategies. Your body, in theory, carries that same architecture. The sweating mechanism is still there. Unfortunately, sweating in a hot, arid environment without reliable access to clean water creates its own rather urgent problem, which we will get to shortly. The wind shifts. Something changes in the air. A heavier note underneath the grass smell, something organic and slightly sharp. You have no immediate framework for identifying it, but the older, quieter parts of your brain are filing it under a category that does not have a modern label, but roughly translates to large animal, recently active, nearby. Your ancestors would have recognized that smell and known exactly what it meant. You recognize that you recognize something without being able to say what. That gap between instinct and knowledge is, in the Pliocene, a genuinely dangerous gap to have. The surprising, lesser-known fact about Pliocene air quality involves volcanic activity. This era coincided with significant tectonic and volcanic events in the East African Rift system. The same geological process that was slowly pulling the continent apart and creating the dramatic landscape you are currently standing in. Volcanic ash events, some of them significant enough to deposit measurable layers across hundreds of kilometers, were not rare occurrences across this epoch. During and after such events, air quality would have deteriorated sharply, with fine particulate matter, sulfur compounds, and fluorine-laden ash creating acute respiratory hazards across wide areas. The hominin fossil record shows individuals who survived into adulthood despite significant physical hardship. Whether any of them had opinions about air quality is, regrettably, not preserved in the geological record. You exhale slowly. The air is still beautiful if you do not think too carefully about what is in it. The grass moves in a long, slow wave to the south. The thing in the grass from earlier, whatever it was, seems to have moved on. Or perhaps it has simply moved somewhere you cannot see it from here. That thought sits with you, pleasantly uncomfortable, as the morning continues to warm around you. Let's take stock of your situation for a moment. You are standing in a semi-arid, mosaic landscape, somewhere in what will eventually become Eastern Africa. The air is warm and surprisingly complex. Something large was in the grass earlier and has since relocated to an unknown position. Your lungs are doing their best. And now, as the initial shock of arrival begins to settle into something more like sustained, low-grade anxiety, your brain starts asking a very reasonable question, a question so obvious and so fundamental that it is almost embarrassing how quickly it becomes urgent. Where exactly are you? In the modern world, this question is almost never genuinely difficult. You have a phone. The phone has satellites. The satellites have opinions about your precise location, down to a few meters, delivered instantly and for free, which is one of those modern miracles, so normalized that it barely registers as remarkable. 3 million years ago, that infrastructure does not exist, not even conceptually. There are no roads, no settlements, no distant city glow on the horizon to orient yourself by at night. There are no landmarks with names. There is no map. not even a mental one, because you have never been here before, and neither has anyone who could have told you about it. What you have is the sun, which is helpful in a broad directional sense. It rises in the east, sets in the west, sits south of overhead if you are in the northern hemisphere, and north of overhead if you are in the southern, which in East Africa during the Pliocene means it tracks in a way that a modern person with some camping experience might use to maintain a rough heading. But maintaining a rough heading and knowing where you are two entirely different things. You can walk confidently east for 3 hours and have absolutely no idea whether you are walking toward water, away from it, into better terrain or worse, toward a territorial predator's core range, or safely away from one. Your Australopithecus contemporaries did not have this problem, and that is not because they had better technology. They didn't. Not in any form you would currently recognize as such. They had something more fundamental. They had accumulated spatial knowledge, passed through social groups, reinforced by daily experience across lifetimes spent in the same regional landscape. Individual members of a hominin group likely knew their home range in extraordinary detail: water sources, seasonal fruiting trees, safe sleeping sites, the likely locations of predators at different times of day. This knowledge was not written down. It was carried in memory, behavior, and the social fabric of the group. Researchers have not fully agreed on exactly how far early hominin home ranges extended, or how that knowledge was transmitted between individuals and across generations. But the evidence strongly suggests it was sophisticated, practical, and absolutely critical to survival. You have none of it. The grass here comes to approximately your waist in the open areas, though ahead of you, it thickens toward a low drainage line, where it grows taller and denser, interrupted by the dark canopy of acacia trees. Those trees probably mean water, or at least the memory of water, the geological habit of water, visiting that spot seasonally. That is useful information, and you have correctly intuited it, which is mildly encouraging. Unfortunately, moving toward dense vegetation along a watercourse in the Pliocene is also, as we will discuss in some detail shortly, an activity with a fairly robust set of associated risks. Here is something that tends to get overlooked when people imagine prehistoric navigation. The landscape itself was not static. 3 million years ago, the East African environment was dynamic in ways that operated on timescales, both longer and shorter than a human lifetime. Rivers changed course, seasonal lakes appeared and vanished. Vegetation communities shifted with rainfall patterns that varied year to year. A water source that your group visited reliably for a decade might simply not be there one dry season. A route through a particular valley that was safe and familiar might be blocked by a new territorial group, or made dangerous by the flooding of a previously crossable stream. Navigation in this world required not just knowing the landscape, but constantly updating that knowledge, remaining alert to change, and being flexible enough to adapt when the map in your head stopped matching the ground under your feet. The surprisingly interesting wrinkle here involves recent research into early hominin cognitive mapping abilities. Some paleoanthropologists have argued, based on the distribution of stone tool raw materials found at ancient sites, that hominins of this general era were transporting specific types of stone significant distances, in some cases potentially dozens of kilometers, suggesting they had mental maps of resource locations across wide areas. Others argue more conservatively that these distances reflect the gradual movement of materials through exchange or group migration, rather than individual long-distance travel. The debate continues. And it is a genuinely fascinating one, because the answer changes quite significantly how we understand the minds of the creatures sharing this landscape with you. You turn slowly, taking in the full 360 degrees of your situation. Grass, trees, along the low ground, open hillside rising to the northeast, a smear of darker cloud building on the western horizon that probably means afternoon rain is coming. Your orientation is approximately east, based on the sun. You know you are somewhere in eastern Africa. You know the general geological era. Beyond that, the specifics dissolve into a warm, rustling, beautiful, entirely indifferent uncertainty. You pick a direction. The low ground, the trees, the probable water. It is not necessarily the wrong choice, but it is made with almost none of the information your ancestors would have brought to that same decision, and that deficit is going to matter very soon. You have been walking for perhaps 40 minutes now. The sun has climbed higher, the air has warmed accordingly, and your body has begun sending the first quiet signals of a need it considers fairly non-negotiable. You are hungry. This is not surprising. You arrived in the Pliocene without breakfast. The morning has been emotionally demanding by any reasonable standard, and your metabolism, designed for a world of refrigerators and corner stores, is running its usual schedule without much concern for your current geographical and temporal situation. Your stomach would like something to eat, preferably soon, preferably something familiar. Here is the problem. Nothing here is familiar. Not really. The landscape around you is productive, in the biological sense. Life is abundant. Plants are flowering, fruiting, leafing out in the warm season light. There are insects everywhere, which is its own category of potential nutrition. You are probably not yet desperate enough to seriously consider. There are seeds in the grass heads, brushing against your legs as you walk. There are roots and tubers in the soil beneath your feet, though you cannot see them. There are berries on a low shrub you are passing right now, small and dark, and almost certainly something, though you could not say what. And this is precisely where your 21st century food knowledge, which is actually quite extensive in its own domain, fails you almost completely. You know how a supermarket works. You know which aisle has the pasta. You might even know how to cook several things from scratch, which puts you ahead of a significant portion of your contemporaries. What you almost certainly do not know is which of the plants currently within arm's reach are edible, which are mildly toxic, which are severely toxic, and which are edible only after specific preparation that removes compounds your body cannot process safely. That knowledge, in the modern world, has been so thoroughly outsourced to agricultural systems, food processing infrastructure, and regulatory frameworks that most people carry almost none of it in usable form. Your Pliocene neighbors carried essentially all of it, and that was not an accident. Ethnobotanical research into contemporary foraging societies, used carefully as a window into the deep past, suggests that experienced foragers typically have detailed working knowledge of hundreds of plant species in their home range, including edibility, seasonality, preparation requirements, and medicinal properties. This knowledge is built over years of observation and instruction, beginning in childhood, refined through a lifetime of practice. It is one of the most complex, practical knowledge systems that human beings have ever developed, and it is almost entirely invisible in the modern world because we stopped needing it in our daily lives somewhere around the agricultural revolution. The dark berries on the shrub you are examining look appealing, small, glossy, clustered in a way that feels instinctively promising. Here is a rule of thumb that foraging guides sometimes offer. Brightly colored berries are often toxic, while dark blue and black berries are more frequently edible. This rule is not wrong exactly, but it is dangerously approximate. There are dark berries in various ecosystems that will cause anything from mild digestive distress to organ failure. And the Pliocene plant community is not the same as the plant community those guides were written about. You are not in a modern forest. The species here are ancestral, related to, but not identical, with their modern descendants, and the biochemical profiles of their fruits reflect evolutionary relationships that no modern field guide has mapped. Scientists still debate the extent to which early hominins relied on cooking and food processing to expand their dietary range during this period, with some researchers arguing that even very basic thermal processing of foods, holding things near fire, for instance, may have begun earlier than the archaeological record currently confirms. If that is true, it would mean that the digestive systems of Pliocene hominins were already beginning to adapt to a cooked food diet, which would in turn mean that the raw Pliocene landscape offered them challenges that modern foraging guides do not fully account for either. You leave the berries alone. It is the correct decision, even if it feels unnecessarily cautious, with your stomach making its opinions known. The grass seeds are a more tempting option. Grass seeds are, at the most fundamental level, what cereal grains are, and humans have been eating cereal grains for a very long time. The problem is processing. Raw grass seeds in any significant quantity are difficult to digest, and several species produce compounds in their outer layers that cause irritation to the digestive tract. Your ancestors solved this problem gradually over enormous timescales, developing the tools and techniques to grind, soak, and eventually cook grains into something genuinely nourishing. You have no grinding stone. You have no vessel for soaking. You have no fire. The insects, which have been hovering at the edge of your consideration this whole time, are actually your most nutritionally reliable option in this landscape. A fact your appetite continues to find deeply unpersuasive. There are tubers in the ground. Wild tubers, ancestral relatives of things like wild yams, were likely a critical caloric resource for early hominins in East Africa, providing dense, starchy nutrition that could sustain activity across long foraging days. But finding them requires knowing where to look, recognizing the surface signs of underground storage organs, and having some way to excavate them, since many grow at depths that make casual retrieval impossible without tools. You are beginning to understand something important about the Pliocene food landscape. It is not stingy, it is not barren. It is, by any ecological measure, generous with its resources, but its generosity is conditional. It rewards specific knowledge, specific skills, specific tools, and a specific relationship with the landscape built over time. Without those things, you are surrounded by food in the same way that someone standing in a library is surrounded by information. Technically true, and practically nearly useless if you cannot read the language. Your stomach continues its quiet campaign for attention. You keep walking toward the trees. The trees are closer now. You can see them properly. A loose cluster of acacias, their flat canopies spreading wide against the midday sky. Their trunks pale and slightly twisted in the way of trees that have negotiated for decades with both drought and browsing animals taller than you. Beneath them, the ground changes color, darker, more clay-like. The grass gives way to shorter, patchier growth, and between the patches, you can see the cracked surface pattern of soil that floods seasonally and dries to a hard mosaic in between. There is almost certainly water here, or very recently was, and further along the drainage line, where the trees grow thicker and the shade deepens, there is a sound that your brain registers before you consciously process it. Moving water, quiet but consistent, a small stream, or perhaps a seep, groundwater, finding its way to the surface through some crack in the underlying rock, pooling in a shallow depression before continuing downslope in a thin, clear thread. You are thirsty. You have been thirsty for a while, actually, though the hunger and the navigation anxiety have been competing for your attention. Now, standing within sight of water, the thirst moves to the front of the queue with considerable authority. Your mouth is dry. The morning's walking has cost you sweat. The Pliocene sun is not gentle, and the water, catching a slant of light through the acacia canopy, looks genuinely beautiful, clear and cool and close. Do not drink it. This is one of those moments where the gap between instinct and knowledge becomes acutely consequential. The water looks clean because water always looks clean unless it is visibly turbid or discolored. And visual inspection tells you almost nothing useful about the biological contents of a natural water source in the Pliocene. What that water contains, in addition to the hydrogen and oxygen your body urgently wants, is a community of microorganisms representing millions of years of undisturbed aquatic evolution. Bacteria, protozoa, helminth eggs, viral particles, a biological landscape your immune system has never trained for and has no established defenses against. Modern travelers to regions without reliable water treatment infrastructure are warned extensively about waterborne illness, and those warnings apply to modern pathogens, organisms that have co-evolved with human immune systems for thousands of years in a kind of ongoing negotiation between pathogen and host. The organisms in this Pliocene stream have had no such negotiation with anything resembling your immune system. They are not adapted to you. You are not adapted to them. The encounter would be, from a microbiological standpoint, genuinely novel for both parties, and novelty in host-pathogen interactions tends to favor the pathogen. Researchers have not fully agreed on how significant waterborne disease pressure was for early hominins during the Pliocene, partly because soft tissue pathology leaves almost no trace in the fossil record, and partly because the microbial communities of ancient water sources are not directly recoverable from the geological record. What paleoanthropologists can observe is that early hominin groups showed strong preferences for certain types of water sources over others, and that proximity to water was a consistent factor in site selection, suggesting both dependence on water and some behavioral sophistication about which water to approach and how. That sophistication, again, is something you do not currently possess. But water is not merely a chemical and biological hazard in the Pliocene. It is also, and perhaps more immediately, a social and ecological one. Watering holes and permanent water sources in semi-arid environments function as obligate gathering points for essentially every animal in the regional ecosystem. Every species that needs water, which is every species, must visit these locations regularly. This creates a concentration of activity that is, from an ecological standpoint, enormously efficient for predators. You do not need to range widely looking for prey if you simply wait near the one resource that prey cannot avoid needing. The shallow pool ahead of you, pretty as it is almost certainly visited regularly by every significant animal in this part of the landscape. The tracks in the clay around its edges confirm this, if you know how to read them. which is itself a skill requiring years of learned pattern recognition. There are large prints you might tentatively identify as bovid, some kind of ancient antelope or a buffalo relative. There are smaller, more delicate impressions. And there, at the far edge of the pool, where the mud is softest and darkest, there are prints that your nervous system identifies before your conscious mind does. Large, round, the retracted claw impression of a big cat. Something was here not long ago. The edges of the prints are still sharp. Here is the surprisingly compelling ecological detail about Pliocene water sources in East Africa. The tectonic activity of the East African rift system was not only reshaping the landscape, it was also influencing the chemistry of regional water sources in ways that had direct consequences for the animals depending on them. Rift-associated volcanic activity contributed minerals to groundwater systems, and some researchers have suggested that the mineral profiles of certain water sources may have influenced the health and population dynamics of the hominin groups using them. Though this remains an area of active and somewhat contested investigation, you crouch at the water's edge, not drinking, just looking. Your reflection looks back at you, slightly disheveled, moderately anxious, squinting against the light. The water is cold against your fingertips when you reach in, genuinely cold in a way that is immediately pleasant and very difficult to resist. Across the pool, something moves in the long grass beyond the tree line, a shape, low and horizontal, that stops when you look directly at it. The watering hole, it turns out, is already occupied. You stand up slowly. You step back from the water's edge. You are thirsty, hungry, uncertain of your location, and now very aware that something is watching you from the grass on the other side of a small, beautiful, extremely dangerous pool of water. The afternoon is only just beginning. You back away from the water slowly. The shape in the grass has not moved, which is somehow worse than if it had. A predator that moves is a predator you can track. A predator that holds perfectly still is a predator that is doing something deliberate, and deliberate stillness in a large carnivore is not a behavioral mode associated with disinterest. Your legs carry you backward without any conscious instruction from your higher brain, which has temporarily ceded operational authority to something older and considerably less articulate, but much better at this particular situation. You make it back to the edge of the acacia shade. The shape in the grass remains motionless. After a long moment, you cannot actually be sure it is still there at all. The grass has shifted slightly in a breeze. The light has changed, and the outline you were tracking has dissolved back into the general texture of the vegetation. This is not reassuring. This is, if anything, less reassuring than seeing it clearly. Welcome to the Pliocene predator problem. The carnivore guild of Eastern Africa 3 million years ago was, by any modern standard, extraordinary, not in the sense of being impossibly monstrous. The Pliocene was not a landscape populated by creatures of science fiction scale, but in the sense of being diverse, effective, and operating across every temporal and ecological niche available to large predators in a productive savanna woodland mosaic. The sheer number of predator species sharing this landscape and the range of strategies they employed created a threat environment of remarkable complexity. Dinophiles was one of the more quietly terrifying residents of this world, a genus of large felid, cat, in the broadest sense, though not a direct ancestor of any modern cat species. Dinophilis was roughly the size of a modern leopard, perhaps slightly larger, with semi-saber-like canine teeth that were not the dramatic curved sabers of the more famous Smilodon, but were still substantially larger than anything in a modern big cat's dental arsenal. What made Dinophilis particularly interesting and particularly concerning from your current perspective is that paleontological evidence from several African sites suggests it may have had a specific predatory focus on hominins. Fossil assemblages at certain cave sites show hominin remains alongside Dinophilis remains in patterns that some researchers have interpreted as evidence of repeated, targeted predation on early human relatives. Scientists still debate the extent to which Dinophilis was a specialist hominin predator versus a generalist that simply included hominins in a broader diet when opportunity arose. The distinction matters for understanding the evolutionary pressure this animal placed on early human cognition and social behavior. If hominins were a preferred prey item, then the arms race between predator intelligence and prey intelligence was running at high intensity throughout this period. If hominins were merely occasional prey, the pressure was real, but less acute. Either way, from your position at the edge of an acacia grove, with something watching you from the grass, the debate is largely academic. Pachyrhacota was another neighbor you would not have chosen given options. Often called the giant hyena, though that name undersells it somewhat, Pachyrhacota brevirostris was the largest hyanid that ever lived, substantially bigger than a modern spotted hyena, with bone-crushing jaw mechanics, operating at a scale that made it capable of processing the skeletal remains of very large animals. It was almost certainly a social animal, like its modern relatives, which means it did not arrive alone. A group of Pachyrhacota operating in your vicinity was not a problem that individual courage or improvised weaponry was going to resolve satisfactorily. But perhaps the most psychologically destabilizing aspect of the Pliocene predator landscape was not any single species. It was the layering. Modern African ecosystems, already considered among the most predator-rich on Earth, represent a somewhat reduced version of their Pliocene predecessors. 3 million years ago, large carnivore diversity in East Africa was significantly higher. You had multiple large felid species, multiple hyanid species, large hunting dogs, crocodilians in any water body of meaningful size, and various other carnivores, occupying niches that no longer exist in the modern fauna. The landscape was not simply dangerous, it was dangerous from multiple directions, simultaneously, using multiple strategies, at multiple times of day and night. Your Australopithecus contemporaries navigated this environment every day of their lives, and they did so primarily through group cohesion, collective vigilance, and an intimate knowledge of predator behavior patterns in their home range. A group of hominins, alert and coordinated, was a much more difficult target than an individual. The archaeological and paleontological evidence suggests that early hominins spent considerable time and cognitive energy on predator awareness, scanning, alarm calling, choosing sleeping sites with natural defensive advantages, moving through risky terrain quickly, and in groups. You are alone. You have been here for a few hours. Your predator awareness training consists primarily of things you have read or watched on screens, filtered through a comfortable assumption that you were always on the safe side of the glass. Here is the surprisingly hopeful note in all of this. The fossil record suggests that early hominins were remarkably successful at surviving in this predator-rich environment. Not through physical superiority, they were not faster, stronger, or better armed than their predators, but through cognitive and social strategies that proved extraordinarily effective over time. The ability to read predator behavior, communicate threat information rapidly within a group, remember and share knowledge about individual dangerous animals in a territory. These capabilities were being refined and extended during exactly this period, and they worked. The grass across the pool shivers. Something moves through it, low and fluid, heading away from you along the drainage line. It does not look back. You realize you have been holding your breath. You let it out slowly, quietly, trying to remember whether you read somewhere that making direct eye contact with large cats was advisable or inadvisable. You cannot remember. This is, in the Pliocene, the kind of gap in practical knowledge that tends to resolve itself one way or another before you get a chance to look it up. The afternoon light is shifting. The shadows under the acacias are lengthening almost imperceptibly. Time is passing, and the sun is beginning its slow argument toward the western horizon. Night in this world has opinions about people who are still outside when it arrives. The shadows under the acacias have lengthened by a finger's width since you last noticed them, which means the afternoon is genuinely progressing whether you are ready for it or not. You have retreated to a position with your back to the widest trunk available, an instinct that is actually correct, one of the few your modern brain has produced unprompted today. Having something solid behind you reduces the directions from which a threat can approach, and that reduction, however modest, is the kind of marginal advantage that accumulates into survival over time. You are learning, slowly and under considerable duress, but learning. Somewhere not far from where you are sitting, there are other hominins. You have not seen them yet, but the evidence of their presence is there, if you know how to read it. A small pile of fractured stone near the base of a termite mound 30 meters away. The kind of angular, deliberately struck flakes that do not occur naturally. A slight depression in the soil beneath a shaded overhang where the ground has been repeatedly compressed by bodies, resting in the same spot over time. The faint smell of something processed, something that was alive and is now being made into something else, drifting from a direction you cannot quite pin down. These are the traces of Australopithecus afarensis, your distant cousins, conducting the ordinary business of their day in a landscape they understand with an intimacy you are only beginning to appreciate, and they are, it must be said, considerably better at this than you are. Australopithecus afarensis, the species most famously represented by the fossil known as Lucy, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974, lived in East Africa across a span of roughly 1 million years, from about 3.9 to 2.9 million years ago. They were bipedal, walking upright on the ground with a gait that was not quite modern human in its biomechanics, but was fully functional for covering terrain. Their brains were smaller than yours, roughly a third of the volume of a modern human brain. But brain size alone is a poor proxy for practical intelligence, and the behavioral evidence strongly suggests these were cognitively sophisticated animals operating effective survival strategies in a complex and demanding environment. They were also, in certain physical respects, more capable than you in this specific landscape. Their bodies retained adaptations for arboreal movement, climbing trees, that modern humans have largely lost. Their fingers and toes showed curvature consistent with gripping branches. Their shoulder joints preserved a range of motion useful for overhead movement. This matters enormously in a world where trees represent the primary refuge from terrestrial predators, the primary sleeping platform for safety, and an important food resource in their own right. You can climb a tree. Technically, Australopithecus afarensis could climb a tree efficiently, quickly, and probably while carrying something. researchers have not fully agreed on the balance between terrestrial and arboreal behavior in Australopithecus afarensis, whether they slept primarily in trees, how much time they spent foraging at height versus on the ground, and how their locomotor capabilities compared in practice to what skeletal analysis suggests in theory. This debate has been running for decades and shows no particular sign of resolution, which is itself a testament to how much remains genuinely uncertain about the daily lives of these creatures. What is less debated is their social structure. At least in broad outline, Australopithecus groups were almost certainly structured around long-term social bonds, with collective awareness of the surrounding environment maintained through continuous communication. The specific nature of that communication, whether it included anything resembling language or was closer to the rich but non-linguistic signaling systems of modern great apes, is another area of active and fascinating disagreement. But the functional outcome was a group that was collectively smarter than any of its individual members, pooling sensory information, sharing attention, and distributing the cognitive load of surviving in a dangerous landscape across multiple minds simultaneously. You, sitting alone against your acacia trunk, are experiencing the absence of that collective intelligence very directly. Here is something that genuinely reframes how most people think about these early hominins. The stone tools found at sites associated with hominins of this general period, the Oldowan tradition, simple but effective, represent not just a technological achievement, but a cognitive one. Producing even the simplest intentional stone flake requires understanding that a rock has a specific geometry, that striking it at a particular angle with a particular force will predictably produce a particular result, and that the resulting sharp edge can then be applied to a secondary task. This is causal reasoning operating across multiple steps, requiring the holder of the tool to maintain a mental model of a process they are manipulating. It is not the cognitive equivalent of your smartphone, but it is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite remarkable. The pile of struck flakes near the termite mound catches your eye again. Someone made those, deliberately, recently. The edges catch the afternoon light with a brightness that means they have not yet had time to acquire the patina that older exposed stone surfaces develop. Whoever made them was here within the last day or two, and wherever they went with purpose, with a direction in mind, with knowledge of the landscape that would guide them there, with companions who shared that knowledge and that direction. You find yourself, in this moment, not pitying your ancient relatives for what they lacked. You find yourself quietly envying what they had, the groundedness of it, the specific, earned, embodied knowledge of one place, one landscape, one community of creatures and plants and water sources and seasonal patterns. The way that knowledge would feel, not like information stored externally and retrieved on demand, but like something woven into the body itself, expressed in which direction you turn without thinking, in what you reach for without looking, in how you read the quality of light on grass and know, without being able to explain how you know, what it means for the next hour. The afternoon breeze carries a sound from somewhere to the north, not a predator sound, something lighter, voices almost, not words you can understand, but the cadence of social communication, the rhythm of a group of intelligent creatures going about their afternoon together. You are alone in their world, and for the first time today, that feels less like a physical danger and more like a quiet, specific kind of loneliness. The sun is lower now. You can feel the change. Before you fully register it visually, something in the quality of the light shifting from the flat brightness of midday to the warmer, more directional gold of late afternoon. Shadows that were short and forgettable are now long and specific, each acacia casting a precise dark replica of itself across the reddish ground to the east. The temperature has dropped perhaps 2 or 3 degrees, which feels meaningless in abstract, but registers immediately on skin that has been warm all day. A slight coolness arrives on the breeze, not unpleasant yet, carrying the smell of the grass, heating, and then releasing its stored warmth as the sun begins losing its authority over the landscape. You need to think about shelter. This thought arrives with a calm urgency that your brain has been deferring for most of the day, occupied as it was with more immediate problems. But the dropping sun has activated something instinctive and insistent. The night is coming. In the modern world, this is a transition you barely notice. You move from one lit interior to another, the darkness outside a backdrop rather than a condition you actually inhabit. Here, the night is not a backdrop. It is an environment, and it is an environment for which you are, by any honest assessment, almost entirely unprepared. The temperature drop in the Pliocene East African landscape between day and night could be substantial, particularly in the semi-arid upland areas where you have spent your day. Daytime temperatures in the upper 20s Celsius could give way to overnight lows that approached or dipped below 10 degrees, especially in the dry season when cloud cover was minimal and radiative cooling of the ground proceeded efficiently through the long, clear night. Modern visitors to the East African highlands are routinely surprised by how cold the nights become. This is not a tropical warmth that persists through the darkness. The days can be genuinely hot, and the nights genuinely cold, and the transition between them happens faster than you might expect. You are wearing what you arrived in, which is, relative to the thermal demands of a Pliocene night in the open, approximately nothing of value. Your Australopithecus contemporaries had fur, not the dense insulating pelage of a cold-adapted animal, but body hair providing at least some insulation against mild temperature drops, combined with a body size and metabolic rate calibrated for this specific thermal environment over millions of years. The question of exactly when hominins lost most of their body hair is one of the more entertaining ongoing debates in paleoanthropology. Estimates range quite widely, and the fossil record preserves essentially no direct evidence of soft tissue like skin and hair. Some researchers argue that significant hair reduction occurred very early in hominin evolution, linked to the efficiency of sweating as a cooling mechanism, while others suggest it happened considerably later. Where exactly you fall on this timeline, given that you are 3 million years in the past, is the kind of detail that would be worth knowing right now. What you can do, in the absence of fur, is find something that functions as insulation. Dry grass, gathered in quantity, is a genuinely effective insulating material. Its air pockets trap body heat in the same way that modern synthetic insulation does, and early humans across many later periods used grass bedding both for warmth and as a barrier between their bodies and the cold ground. The ground itself is a significant heat sink. Lying directly on soil at night conducts body heat away from you at a rate that accelerates the onset of hypothermia in ways that feel gradual and then suddenly serious. You begin collecting dry grass from the open area adjacent to the acacia grove, armful by armful, carrying it back to the overhang you identified earlier, the shallow rock shelter where the ground is compressed from repeated use, which now seems not just convenient, but actively wise. Something used this shelter. Something came back to it regularly enough to leave a mark. The question of what that something was is worth holding. But the shelter itself has advantages that outweigh the uncertainty. It has a ceiling, which dramatically reduces radiative heat loss to the open sky. It has 3 sides of rock, which block wind from most directions. It faces roughly east, which means it will catch the first morning sun. Here is the surprisingly specific scientific detail about prehistoric sleeping sites that tends to catch people off guard. Researchers examining preserved sleeping surfaces at archaeological sites in South Africa, specifically at Sibudu Cave, though from a considerably later period than your current location, found evidence of sophisticated bedding construction using specific plant materials selected for their insect-repelling properties. The occupants of those sites were not simply grabbing the nearest available vegetation, but were making deliberate choices about which plants to include in their bedding based on properties that reduced parasitic insect loads overnight. Whether hominins of the Pliocene demonstrated similar selectivity is unknown, but it suggests that the intelligence applied to something as apparently simple as where and how to sleep was considerably more sophisticated than casual observation might suggest. You pile the grass into the back of the overhang, making it as thick as your available time and energy allow. The sun is now visibly close to the horizon, the sky above it shifting through orange into something deeper. The beauty of it is, objectively, extraordinary. The kind of sunset that would attract photographers from considerable distances in the modern world. Here, it is a deadline. The first stars appear before the sun is fully down, emerging in the deepening blue of the eastern sky with a clarity that no modern person living near artificial light has ever actually seen. There are thousands of them, then tens of thousands. The Milky Way, when it arrives, is not a faint smear, but a genuine structural feature of the sky, a river of light so detailed and so bright that it casts a faint, directionless shadow on the pale ground. It is one of the most beautiful things you have ever seen. You are also shivering, the temperature having dropped faster than you anticipated, your grass pile feeling significantly less substantial than it did 20 minutes ago when you were building it in the last of the warmth. The night, in all its ancient, indifferent magnificence, has arrived. You are lying in your grass pile, which is doing a reasonable impression of being adequate insulation while not quite committing to the role fully. The rock of the overhang above you is close enough that you could touch it by raising one hand. And this proximity, which felt slightly claustrophobic when you first settled in, now feels like one of the better decisions of your day. The stone has retained some warmth from the afternoon sun and is releasing it slowly into the shallow space around you, a geological generosity you are quietly grateful for. The grass beneath and around you rustles with every small movement, which means you are very aware of every small movement you make, and also very aware that anything else moving in or near the grass would be similarly audible. This awareness is not relaxing. In the modern world, sleep preparation involves a fairly specific ritual. You dim lights. You perhaps check your phone one final time in a decision you will immediately regret. You adjust pillows. You pull a blanket to a preferred position. Then you close your eyes in a warm, enclosed space specifically designed to be safe. And your brain, knowing on some level that you are secure, allows itself to descend through the stages of sleep with reasonable confidence that the situation will be similar when you return to consciousness. Your brain here is not confident. This is not irrational. The calculation your nervous system is running in the Pliocene is a genuinely different one than it runs in your bedroom. In your bedroom, the probability of a predator entering while you sleep is so close to zero that your brain has essentially stopped including it in the overnight threat assessment. Here, that probability is not zero. It is not enormous, particularly given the modest shelter advantages of your overhang and the fact that large predators tend to operate along predictable patrol routes that may or may not intersect with your current location. But it is real, and your nervous system knows it is real, and the result is a quality of alertness that sits underneath even your most exhausted attempts to rest. Australopithecus and its contemporaries almost certainly slept in trees when possible. For exactly this reason, arboreal sleeping, spending the night in the branches of a tree at sufficient height to be inaccessible to most terrestrial predators, was almost certainly the default sleeping strategy for early hominins during this period, just as it is for modern chimpanzees and other great apes. The fossil evidence for sleeping platform construction in great apes is well established, and there is ongoing discussion among researchers about when exactly in hominin evolution the transition from arboreal to terrestrial sleeping occurred. Since this transition would have had profound implications for group size, social organization, and ultimately brain development, researchers have not fully agreed on whether Australopithecus afarensis slept primarily in trees, primarily on the ground in sheltered locations, or used a flexible combination of both strategies depending on local conditions and resource availability. The skeletal evidence for arboreal capability suggests trees remained a viable and likely used option, but the specifics remain genuinely unresolved. What seems clear is that sleeping site selection was a deliberate and consequential decision, not a casual one. Your overhang is, in the absence of a climbable tree with suitable branching structure nearby, and you definitely looked, a reasonable compromise. The rock above and around you provides the same basic function as height does in a tree. It limits the approach vectors available to a predator, forcing any threat to commit to a visible approach rather than arriving from an unexpected direction. This is why caves and rock shelters appear so consistently in the archaeological record of early hominins across Africa and eventually beyond. They were not chosen for their aesthetic qualities, though some of them are genuinely beautiful. They were chosen because they were defensible. Here is the surprisingly compelling detail about prehistoric sleep that researchers have pieced together from various lines of evidence. A 2015 study examining sleep patterns in a contemporary Tanzanian forager group found that these individuals, living without artificial light and with genuine predation risk as a background condition, slept in consolidated but relatively short bouts, typically around 6 to 6.5 hours, and that the entire group did not sleep simultaneously. Natural variation in sleep timing across individuals meant that at any given point during the night, some members of the group were in lighter sleep phases and more responsive to environmental sounds. This staggered pattern, the researchers argued, may represent an ancient adaptation, essentially a distributed early warning system that no individual planned, but the group collectively implemented through normal variation in sleep architecture. You are alone, which means the distributed early warning system is just you, working solo, which is less than ideal. The grass rustles. You open your eyes. The Milky Way has rotated slightly. You have been lying here longer than it felt. The rustling was the wind, or a small animal, or nothing at all. And the distinction between these options is something you are currently unable to determine, which means your heart rate is doing the cautious thing and elevating slightly until further information becomes available. Further information does not become available. The rustling stops. The night continues. Sleep, when it comes, arrives in installments, rather than as a single sustained event. You drift down into it and then rise back up at intervals, pulled toward the surface by sounds, real and imagined, that your resting brain flags for attention. The deep, unconscious confidence that allows modern humans to sleep through 8 hours in a safe room is a learned thing, a behavioral adaptation to an environment of reliable safety. And it turns out it is not entirely portable to environments where the safety is considerably less reliable. Between one of these intervals of lighter sleep and the next, you become aware of a sound in the distance, low, resonant, traveling through the night air with a clarity that the daytime soundscape, busy with insects and birds and wind, would never have allowed. Something calling, far enough away that the specific character of the sound is ambiguous, but large. Whatever is making it is large. You pull the grass closer around you. The stone above is still faintly warm. The stars, through the open face of the overhang, are extraordinary. You close your eyes again and negotiate as your ancestors did every single night of their lives. The delicate compromise between the rest your body desperately needs and the awareness the world quietly insists upon. Somewhere in the small hours of the Pliocene night, you have achieved something that might generously be called sleep, in the sense that your conscious mind has retreated to a lower operational level, and your body has taken the opportunity to begin some of its more urgent maintenance work. Your muscles are grateful. Your feet, which have covered more unfamiliar terrain today than they have in months, are engaged in whatever process feet engage in when they are trying to communicate that tomorrow should involve considerably less walking. Your brain is doing the cycling and consolidating that brains do in sleep, filing the day's extraordinary volume of new sensory information into whatever organizational system it uses for experiences that have no existing category, and then something calls, not close, not immediately threatening, at least not from any distance. Your conscious mind can accurately assess in the dark, in a landscape you do not know, without any reference points for how sound travels across this specific terrain at this specific hour, but loud, genuinely, uncomplicatedly loud, in the way that only large animals in open landscapes are loud at night. The sound carrying across the darkness with an ease that makes distance feel unreliable. Your eyes open, your body does not move, another of those older instincts operating without consulting you. But every sense you possess is suddenly and completely engaged. The sound does not repeat immediately. The night absorbs it, and for a long moment, there is only the background layer of the darkness, which is itself not silent at all. This is something modern life has quietly stolen from most people, the true texture of natural nighttime sound. The darkness of the Pliocene was not quiet. It was layered, complex, and continuous in ways that would take considerable time to learn to navigate orally. Insects formed the lowest, most constant stratum of the sound environment, a dense, modulating texture of stridulation and wing beat, and the various calls of countless orthopteran species whose Pliocene ancestors were already occupying every available acoustic niche in the warm African night. This was not the sound of a few crickets chirping pleasantly outside a suburban window. This was a full, dense acoustic environment, a wall of biological sound that varied in intensity and composition across the night. As different species reached their peak activity periods, above the insect layer, the frogs, any standing water within hearing distance, and you are close enough to the drainage line that this means relatively close, contributed the overlapping calls of amphibian species, communicating across the darkness with an urgency that suggests their reproductive schedules were entirely indifferent to your need for sleep. Frog calls in a productive, African wetland environment are not subtle. They are, by design, penetrating, species-specific, and persistent, since the entire point is to be heard over the ambient noise of every other frog trying to accomplish the same thing. Then there were the birds. Scientists still debate the precise composition of avian communities in the Pliocene East African landscape, since bird fossils are fragmentary and often difficult to assign to specific ecological roles. But the broad picture is of a rich and diverse bird fauna occupying every available niche. Nocturnal birds, owls, nightjars, and their relatives were present and active through the night, their calls adding another layer to the acoustic environment. Nightjars in particular, whose modern African representatives produce calls of considerable volume and persistence, would have contributed a churring, mechanical quality to the night air that is distinctive and, until you know what it is, somewhat difficult to locate or identify directionally. Here is the surprisingly interesting detail about prehistoric acoustic environments that tends to reframe how people think about the sensory experience of early hominins. Researchers studying the hearing anatomy of Australopithecus have found that the ear canal dimensions and ossicular structures of these hominins suggest a hearing range and sensitivity that in some frequencies differed from modern humans, potentially more acute in ranges important for detecting specific environmental sounds relevant to their ecological context. The precise implications of these anatomical differences for the actual experience of sound in the Pliocene are not fully understood, but the suggestion is that your ancestors may have been listening to this same night soundscape with ears slightly better tuned to it than yours. The large call comes again, closer, or at least it seems closer, though sound in open landscapes at night performs tricks with perceived distance that even experienced listeners find disorienting. It is a deep, resonant sound with a quality that you do not have a modern reference for, not quite like anything in the catalog of animal sounds your culture has given you access to. This is itself informative. The large predators of the Pliocene were not all ancestors of modern species. Some of them were evolutionary dead ends, lineages that would not survive to the present, and their vocalizations are not preserved in any living species that could teach your nervous system what to make of them. Your nervous system is doing its best with incomplete information and arriving at the reasonable conclusion that whatever is making that sound is large, is somewhere in the middle distance to the north, and is either communicating with others of its kind or announcing its presence to the landscape in general. Both possibilities have implications you would prefer not to dwell on in the dark. A different sound arrives from the opposite direction, shorter, higher, with a social quality to it. The kind of call that sounds like one individual alerting another. Then movement sounds, vegetation displacement, the soft percussion of something moving through grass at a pace that is not panicked but is purposeful. Something was resting nearby and has now decided to relocate, a decision that, under the circumstances, seems entirely reasonable. The insects continue their dense, indifferent chorus. An owl calls twice from somewhere above and to your left in the acacia canopy, close enough that you can hear the slight mechanical quality of the sound before it smooths into the night air. The frogs continue their negotiations. You lie in your grass, listening to a night that has been running exactly like this, layered, complex, alive, for millions of years before you arrived, and will continue to run exactly like this for millions of years after you leave. You are not part of this soundscape. You are in it, temporarily, a novel element the night is neither welcoming nor rejecting. simply continuing around you with the magnificent indifference of very old things. The large call does not come a third time. Gradually, so gradually, you cannot identify the exact moment it happens. The tension in your body releases by a fraction. Your breathing slows. The insects are still there. The frogs are still there. The owl has gone quiet. You drift, incrementally, back towards something that might be sleep. The first light arrives, not as sunrise, but as a softening of the darkness. A slow, incremental process of the sky, becoming less absolutely black and more a deep, textured blue that gradually reveals the silhouettes of the acacias against it. You are awake for this, having been pulled back to full consciousness by a sound that turned out to be nothing, or nothing visible, at some point in the last hour before dawn. Your body is stiff in the specific way of bodies that have slept on hard ground with insufficient insulation, a collection of complaints radiating from your hips and shoulders that will make themselves known with increasing volume as the morning progresses. You are also, and this is the detail that is going to matter most over the next several days, beginning the slow process of becoming ill. You do not know this yet. The symptoms are not present in any form you would currently recognize. There is no fever, no obvious discomfort beyond the mechanical soreness of a night on stone. But the biological negotiation between your immune system and the Pliocene microbial landscape has been ongoing since the moment you arrived, and it has not been going entirely in your favor. Every breath of ancient air, every contact with ancient soil, every unwary touch of vegetation, every moment spent near the water source yesterday, each of these interactions has introduced your body to organisms for which it has no established response protocol. The human immune system is extraordinary. This is worth acknowledging before describing how thoroughly the Pliocene would overwhelm it, because the overwhelm is not a consequence of the immune system being inadequate by design. It is a consequence of its being exquisitely calibrated for a different microbial world than the one you have just stepped into. Your immune system carries the accumulated learning of your own lifetime of exposure, the transferred maternal antibodies of your infancy, and the broader immunological heritage of thousands of years of human population history. All the battles your ancestors fought against the pathogens of their own time and place, encoded into the defensive architecture you inherited. None of that heritage was built against the Pliocene. The specific threats are worth considering in some detail, because they are more varied and more interesting than the simple category of dangerous germs might suggest. Soil-transmitted helminths, parasitic worms, whose eggs or larvae live in warm, moist soil and enter the body through skin contact or ingestion, were almost certainly present in the Pliocene landscape in forms related to, but not identical with, their modern descendants. These organisms are ancient. Their basic life cycle strategies predate hominins by an enormous margin. Your skin pressed against the ground all night, and your hands, which have touched soil repeatedly through the day, have been potential entry points for organisms whose modern equivalents infect hundreds of millions of people globally, even today. In a world with soap, shoes, and medical treatment, arthropod vectors, ticks, mosquitoes, biting flies add another dimension to the problem. The Pliocene landscape supported a rich community of blood-feeding insects and arachnids, each carrying its own complement of potential pathogens. Modern tick-borne and mosquito-borne diseases represent a fraction of what these vectors were carrying through evolutionary history, and the pathogens of the Pliocene were not the same strains as their modern descendants. Your immune system would be encountering them without any prior exposure history, without vaccines, and without any pharmaceutical support. Researchers have not fully agreed on the disease burden experienced by early hominin populations during the Pliocene, partly because the evidence is so difficult to recover from the fossil record, and partly because extrapolating from modern forager health data to 3 million-year-old conditions involves assumptions that are challenging to validate. What paleoepidemiological research has established is that infectious disease was almost certainly a significant mortality factor throughout hominin evolution, and that the immune system features distinguishing modern humans from other primates reflect a long history of pathogen pressure, shaping our biology at the genetic level. Here is the surprisingly hopeful note, and it is genuinely surprising. Your Australopithecus contemporaries were not immune to disease. Far from it. They were sick, injured, parasitized, and compromised in ways the fossil record occasionally preserves as lesions in bone, abnormal growth patterns, or healed injuries visible in skeletal remains. Individual specimens in the fossil record show evidence of significant health challenges survived. What they had, over you, was not immunity to the Pliocene microbial landscape, but a lifetime of graduated exposure to it, an immune system that had been trained from infancy by the specific pathogens of this specific place. Their bodies knew this world's diseases because they had grown up fighting them, and the ones that made it to adulthood had already survived the most acute phase of that education. You have skipped the education and arrived directly at the examination. The dawn light is strengthening now, the sky above the acacia canopy moving from blue to pale gold. Birds are beginning, first one, then others, then a general rising tide of avian activity that builds quickly into the full morning chorus. This is something your ears can enjoy without qualification. The bird calls of the Pliocene, carrying the same basic qualities of beauty and complexity that bird calls have always carried, regardless of the specific species producing them. Your body temperature is slightly elevated, not dramatically, not the kind of fever that announces itself as illness, just a degree or so above your baseline, the kind of elevation that reads as slightly warm, slightly less sharp than usual, slightly more effort required for actions that normally feel effortless. Your immune system is working. It is working hard, actually, mobilizing resources and mounting responses to challenges it is encountering for the first time, doing everything it was built to do in the face of novel threats. The question of whether it is working fast enough and whether it has the right tools for the specific challenges it is facing is one that will take several days to answer definitively. You sit up in your grass pile, rolling your shoulders against the stiffness, watching the light grow. You are hungry, deeply thirsty, stiff, and very subtly beginning to be sick in ways you will not recognize for another day or two. The morning is nevertheless beautiful. Golden light arriving through the acacia branches in long, warm shafts. The grass outside the overhang glittering faintly with dew. Another day in the Pliocene is beginning. The question of how many more you will manage is, as yet, open. The morning has established itself fully now, the golden quality of early light, giving way to the cleaner, higher brightness of mid-morning. You have moved from your overhang, driven by thirst and hunger, and the restless urgency of a body that knows it needs resources and does not have them. You have been careful near the water source, taking small amounts from a point upstream of where the larger animal tracks concentrate, using the logic that upstream water is marginally less contaminated than downstream water at a shared watering point. This logic is correct as far as it goes. which is not as far as you would like. You have eaten some grass seeds, which your body is currently processing with moderate reluctance. You have eaten insects, a decision that required considerably more psychological preparation than it deserved given the circumstances, but which your digestive system has accepted without incident. You are managing. The word managing is doing a lot of work in that sentence, but it applies. And then, as you are moving along the drainage line in the growing morning warmth, you see them, a group of hominins, 7 or 8 individuals, moving through the open woodland maybe 80 meters ahead of you. They are bipedal, upright, smaller than you in stature. Adult Australopithecus afarensis stood roughly 1 to 1.5 meters tall, depending on sex, with significant size dimorphism between males and females. They move with a fluid competence through terrain that you have spent a day finding exhausting and hazardous. 2 of them are carrying something, tools, or food, or both. One is watching the surrounding landscape with an attentiveness that does not waver. Several younger individuals move in the interior of the group, a positioning that is not accidental. They have not seen you yet, or perhaps they have, and are choosing not to acknowledge it. That distinction matters enormously, and you have no way of determining which is true. What happens in the next few minutes will depend almost entirely on social signals, on whether you can communicate through posture, movement, and behavior, something that reads as non-threatening within the specific social grammar of this group. And here is the problem. You do not know that grammar. You have not grown up inside it. You have not observed it across years of daily interaction. And you have no way to ask anyone to explain it to you. You are, from a social integration standpoint, functionally illiterate in the only language that currently matters. Early hominin social structures were almost certainly complex in ways that are easy to underestimate. Research into the social behavior of modern great apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, provides the closest available living window into the kinds of social dynamics that may have operated in Australopithecus groups, though with the important caveat that millions of years of separate evolution mean these comparisons are suggestive rather than definitive. What this research consistently shows is that social hierarchies in great ape groups are elaborate, consequential, and expressed through a dense repertoire of behavioral signals, postural cues, facial expressions, vocalizations, grooming interactions, proximity choices, that group members learn to read and produce from infancy. Entering an established group as an unknown individual without the relationship history and behavioral fluency that membership requires is dangerous in modern great ape social contexts. An unfamiliar individual approaching a chimpanzee group, for instance, risks responses ranging from avoidance to active aggression, depending on circumstances, group composition, and the perceived threat level of the stranger. There is no reason to assume that Australopithecus groups were less socially sophisticated in managing stranger interactions, and considerable reason to think they may have been more so, given the cognitive trajectory that leads eventually to modern human social complexity. Scientists still debate the precise nature of intergroup interactions in Australopithecus populations, whether groups were primarily territorial and hostile toward strangers, or whether there were mechanisms for non-aggressive interaction between groups, perhaps at resource-rich locations like water sources or during specific seasonal periods. The answer has significant implications for understanding how knowledge, materials, and genetic diversity moved through the wider hominin population of this period. One of the individuals at the rear of the group has stopped, It is looking directly at you, not the scanning gaze of general environmental monitoring, but the fixed, specific attention of an animal that has registered something new and is assessing it. You are the new thing. You are being assessed. Your instinct is to wave, to make some friendly, open gesture that in the modern world communicates benign intent across language barriers. You suppress this instinct correctly because a sudden upper body movement in the direction of a group of hominins who do not know you is not going to read as friendly. It is going to read as a threat display, and a confusing one, which is arguably worse than a clear one. You stop moving. You make yourself smaller, lowering your center of gravity slightly, avoiding direct eye contact, not looking away completely, which in primate social communication can read as deceptive, but breaking the fixed stare that in most primate contexts reads as challenge or aggression. You keep your hands visible and low. You breathe. Here is the surprisingly nuanced detail about this kind of encounter that researchers piecing together early hominin social behavior have emphasized. The ability to communicate non-aggression across individual and potentially group boundaries may have been one of the critically important social capacities driving early hominin cognitive development, managing the tension between resource competition and the potential benefits of non-hostile interaction with strangers. Trade, information exchange, genetic mixing required sophisticated behavioral flexibility that went beyond simple fight-or-flight responses. The individual watching you makes a sound, short, with an upward inflection that you cannot interpret, but that causes several other group members to redirect their attention toward your position. There is a moment of collective assessment, multiple pairs of eyes, calibrated by evolutionary history for exactly this kind of evaluation, reading you with a thoroughness that your self-awareness finds slightly uncomfortable. Then the group moves on, not fleeing, not approaching, simply continuing in their direction, absorbed back into the movement of the morning. The individual who spotted you is last to look away, maintaining attention on you for several more seconds before turning to follow the others. You have passed some threshold. You do not know which one or what you did that allowed you to pass it. That uncertainty is itself a kind of education in how much of social life, even at this ancient remove, operates through channels too subtle and too fast for conscious analysis to fully capture. You watch them go and feel something that is not quite loneliness and not quite relief, but occupies the space between them. The group of hominins has disappeared into the woodland, absorbed by the trees and the morning light in the way that things in this landscape seem to disappear. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, simply by continuing to move until the distance and the vegetation conspire to render them invisible. You are alone again in the open, which is a condition you are becoming unfortunately accustomed to. The morning is warm, building toward the heat of midday, and the sky overhead is the deep, saturated blue of a day with low humidity and high visibility. You can see a long way in every direction, across the rolling mosaic of grass and scattered woodland, to distant hills that are blue with atmospheric haze at their furthest edges. Those hills, and the larger landscape they are part of, are in the process of changing, not on any time scale you could observe directly, not in a day, not in a year, not in a human lifetime. But the change is real. It is measurable in the geological record, and it is one of the most consequential things happening on the planet during this precise period of the Pliocene. The world you are standing in is not a stable world. It is a world in transition, and the direction of that transition is going to reshape everything on this landscape, including the creatures that walk across it. Approximately 3 million years ago, Earth's climate began shifting into a new regime. The planet had been in a relatively warm phase, warmer than today in global average terms, for an extended period, and now a combination of factors was beginning to tip it toward a long cooling trend that would eventually produce the Pleistocene ice ages. The specific mechanisms driving this shift are a subject of ongoing scientific discussion, but the contributing factors included changes in ocean circulation patterns, the closing of the Central American Seaway as the Isthmus of Panama formed, variations in Earth's orbital parameters, and the long-term drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide through geological processes. The result, playing out slowly across hundreds of thousands of years, was a progressive cooling and drying of large parts of the African continent. The mosaic landscape you are currently walking through, the mix of woodland and grassland that characterizes your current environment, was itself a product of earlier climate shifts, and it was continuing to change. Forests were contracting, grasslands were expanding, the variability of rainfall from year to year and decade to decade was increasing, creating a more unpredictable and challenging environment for the animals and plants adapted to the earlier, more stable conditions. Scientists still debate the precise relationship between this climate shift and the evolutionary trajectory of hominins during the Pliocene and into the Pleistocene, a discussion sometimes framed around the variability selection hypothesis, which proposes that it was not any single climate state, but the increasing variability and unpredictability of climate conditions that drove selection for cognitive flexibility and behavioral adaptability in the hominin lineage. The idea is intuitively appealing. An environment that keeps changing rewards brains that can learn quickly, adjust strategies, and solve novel problems, rather than brains locked into highly specialized responses to stable conditions. Whether this hypothesis fully explains the pattern of hominin evolution is contested, but the broader point that the creatures walking this landscape were being shaped by forces operating at geological timescales, forces they could not perceive or understand, but that were nevertheless selecting intensively among them, is one of the more humbling aspects of standing here in the Pliocene and looking around at what appears to be a settled, permanent landscape. It is not permanent. Nothing here is permanent. The hills on the horizon are being slowly uplifted by the same tectonic forces that are pulling the Rift Valley apart beneath your feet. The grassland you are standing in was woodland not so very long ago in geological terms, and will be something else again in another few 100,000 years. The water source that the hominin group visits daily may not exist in its current form 1,000 years from now. The animals you have been carefully avoiding are themselves in the middle of their own evolutionary stories, lineages that will branch and diverge and mostly end in extinction before the present day. Here is the detail about Pliocene climate change that tends to reframe the entire story in an unexpectedly personal way. The expansion of grasslands in Africa during this period, driven by the cooling and drying climate, was not merely a backdrop to hominin evolution. It was, many researchers argue, an active driver of it. The spread of C4 grasses, which are more efficient at photosynthesis in warm, dry conditions, and which store carbon in a form that is less digestible for many browsers, changed the food landscape in ways that favored animals with specific dietary adaptations. Hominins that could exploit the resources of open grassland environments, including the underground storage organs of grassland plants, the seeds of grass species, and the large herbivores that the grasslands supported, had access to resources that were becoming more abundant as the forests retreated. The grassland, in other words, was not just the setting for the human story. It was one of the authors of it. You walk through it now, feeling the grass against your legs, hearing the insects in it, watching a small bird of unfamiliar species drop from a low branch to the ground and back up again with something in its beak. The landscape feels ancient and settled, the way landscapes always feel to the creatures living in them, carrying no visible record of the slow transformation it is undergoing. The change is in the pollen record, in the isotope ratios of ancient soils, in the shifting proportions of tree and grass across the fossil evidence. It is everywhere and nowhere you can see. The afternoon clouds are building again to the west. The same daily convective process that produced yesterday's distant rain. The air smells faintly of dust and grass, and the particular mineral quality of soil that has not been rained on for several days. Somewhere to the south, a column of large animals is moving across an open hillside, too far away to identify specifically, but large enough that their movement registers as a slow, deliberate procession against the pale grass. The world is going about its ancient business. The climate is doing what climate does, which is change, and the living things in the landscape are doing what living things do, which is adapt or not adapt, survive or not survive, continue or end. You are part of this story now, at least for a little while, standing in a changing world, feeling the warm wind of a cooling planet, watching a landscape that looks permanent and is anything but. The clouds build higher, and the afternoon light shifts, and somewhere behind you, the drainage line continues its seasonal argument with the thirsty ground. The afternoon rain came and went, as it did yesterday, arriving with brief theatrical intensity and departing before it fully committed to the landscape. You found shelter under a dense acacia canopy, which kept perhaps 60% of the rain off you, which in the circumstances felt like a reasonable outcome. The ground around you smells extraordinary in the aftermath. That specific, ancient smell of rain on dry soil, petrichor, which is one of those sensory experiences so universally recognized across human cultures that it probably connects directly to something very old in the human relationship with water and relief. Your ancestors smelled this same smell in this same landscape and felt the same involuntary easing of tension it produces. You are now on your second day in the Pliocene. You have survived the night, navigated a predator encounter, made cautious contact with a hominin group, eaten things your modern palate would prefer not to dwell on, and managed your water intake with the careful anxiety of someone who knows the risks without having the knowledge to fully mitigate them. By any reasonable assessment, you are doing better than might have been expected 24 hours ago. The fossil record, however, has some opinions about your longer-term prospects, and they are delivered with the particular dispassion of evidence that does not care about your feelings. Paleoanthropologists studying the demographics of early hominin populations have developed methods for estimating mortality patterns from the fossil record, examining the ages at death represented in fossil assemblages, the prevalence of healed versus unhealed injuries, the evidence of disease and nutritional stress preserved in bone and dental tissue, and the overall population dynamics implied by the genetic evidence in living descendants. The picture that emerges from this work is of populations under intense selective pressure, with high mortality rates at multiple life stages, and a survivorship curve that looks dramatically different from anything a modern human in a developed nation would recognize as normal. Infant and juvenile mortality was almost certainly very high by modern standards. The investment required to raise a hominin infant to independence was substantial, and the hazards arrayed against that process, predation, disease, nutritional stress during weaning, the consequences of maternal death or incapacitation were considerable. Adult mortality, while lower in proportional terms than juvenile mortality, was shaped by a combination of predation risk, traumatic injury, infectious disease, and the accumulated costs of a physically demanding daily existence in an environment with no medical intervention of any kind. Scientists still debate the average life expectancy at birth for Australopithecus populations, partly because the fossil sample is not large enough to support robust demographic analysis, and partly because taphonomic biases, the ways in which certain individuals and age classes are more or less likely to be preserved and discovered as fossils, make it difficult to reconstruct true population age structures from fossil assemblages. Conservative estimates, drawing on comparisons with modern non-human primates and contemporary foraging populations, suggest that reaching adulthood was itself a significant achievement, and that individuals who survived into their 30s or 40s were doing genuinely well by the standards of their time. You are presumably somewhere in the range of adulthood. This gives you a statistical foundation to work from, though the statistics are not entirely encouraging when you examine them closely. Here is the surprisingly specific thing the fossil record can tell us about individual lives in this period. Dental enamel, which is the hardest substance the human body produces and preserves remarkably well over millions of years, records the history of an individual's nutritional experience during the years of tooth formation in a series of microscopic stress markers called linear enamel hypoplasias. These are tiny horizontal lines, visible under magnification, each one marking a period during which systemic stress, illness, nutritional deficiency, significant physiological disruption interrupted normal enamel formation. Examining the teeth of Australopithecus individuals, researchers find these markers with considerable frequency, indicating that episodes of significant physical stress during childhood were not rare events, but essentially universal experiences, woven into the developmental history of almost every individual who survived to adulthood. These individuals were not weaklings. The evidence indicates the opposite. They were people who had been through things, repeatedly, and kept going. The resilience implicit in a fossil record, full of healed injuries and survived stresses, is, when you sit with it for a moment, genuinely moving. Your own teeth, if examined microscopically, carry whatever stress markers your modern childhood produced, probably fewer than your Australopithecus contemporaries, on average, reflecting the nutritional security and medical infrastructure of the world you grew up in. This means your body, while theoretically capable of significant resilience, has had less practice deploying it than the individuals around you have had. The predation evidence is worth examining too, because it is direct and specific in a way that abstracts like average life expectancy are not. Several fossil sites in East Africa from this general period preserve hominin bones with carnivore tooth marks, evidence of individuals who became prey, whose remains were subsequently processed by whatever animal killed or scavenged them. The frequency and distribution of these marks have been analyzed carefully by researchers trying to understand predation pressure on early hominin populations. The picture is of a genuine and ongoing predation risk, not a rare catastrophe, but a regular feature of the mortality landscape, one that hominin behavior was actively organized around reducing. You have now spent roughly 30 hours in this landscape. You have encountered evidence of large predators, been assessed by a hominin social group, slept inadequately, eaten insufficiently, drunk water of uncertain safety, and begun what is probably an illness your immune system is handling with more determination than effectiveness. On the balance of probabilities derived from the fossil and paleoanthropological record, a modern human dropped into this environment without preparation, knowledge, or social integration would face elevated mortality risk from multiple concurrent causes, with the risk compounding rather than resolving over time. The rain-washed air smells clean. A rainbow has appeared in the east, brief and vivid against the dark retreating cloud. The landscape, having accepted its daily ration of water, is steaming very slightly in the returning sun, the moisture rising from the warm ground in thin, barely visible wisps. You are tired in a way that goes deeper than last night's inadequate sleep. Tired in the way of a body that is working very hard on multiple fronts simultaneously, allocating resources to competing demands: immune response, thermoregulation, physical activity, cognitive monitoring of a threatening environment, and beginning to feel the strain of that allocation in its overall energy budget. The rainbow fades. The sun continues west. Somewhere in the middle distance, in the direction the hominin group went this morning, there is smoke, thin, pale, rising in a lazy column above the tree line. A small fire, carefully managed, tended by hands that know exactly what they are doing. You watch the smoke and feel something you have not felt since you arrived here. Not fear, not hunger, not confusion. Something simpler and older than any of those. You feel the pull toward warmth, toward other people, toward the small managed light in the middle of the enormous dark world. You move toward the smoke. It is not a decision made through careful strategic analysis. You have been doing careful strategic analysis for 2 days now, and the results have been mixed at best. This is something different, something that bypasses the analytical layer entirely and operates from a deeper register, the same register that makes a cold person move toward warmth without needing to think through the logic of it. The smoke means fire. Fire means people. People means the possibility of everything that traveling alone in this landscape has shown you is necessary and nearly impossible to achieve by yourself. You are walking toward it before you have consciously decided to walk toward it, which is itself a small lesson in how motivation actually works. When the stakes are genuine, rather than theoretical, the distance is perhaps a kilometer. The terrain between you and the smoke involves crossing the drainage line, which you do carefully at a narrow point where the channel is shallow and the banks are open enough to see clearly in both directions before committing to the crossing. The water is cold around your ankles. The mud of the far bank is soft and deep and takes your footprint perfectly, adding yours to the collection of impressions already there. Hooves, paws, the small hand-like prints of some primate species smaller than you, and the distinctively bipedal prints of hominins, several individuals, moving in the same direction as the smoke. Following their trail through the woodland is easier than navigating alone has been. The path, if it can be called that, more a pattern of slightly compressed vegetation and cleared low branches than anything deliberate, reflects repeated passage, a route used often enough to leave a trace. You follow it through a stand of trees where the canopy closes overhead and the light becomes green and dappled, where it is several degrees cooler and the bird activity is different, more secretive. The calls shorter and less declarative than the open country birds you have been hearing all day. And then the trees thin, and you are at the edge of a small clearing, and the fire is there. It is modest. The fires of this period were not the great controlled blazes of later human history, not the hearths of established camps with stone surrounds and organized fuel supplies. This is a small, careful thing, a handful of branches arranged with clear intention, burning slowly, producing more smoke than flame in the afternoon warmth, tended rather than wild. Around it, the group you encountered this morning is settled in the relaxed but perpetually alert way of animals that know they are never fully off duty. Several are eating. One is using a stone flake to process something, working with the focused, practiced efficiency of someone doing a task so familiar it requires almost no conscious attention. Two younger individuals are near each other, engaged in the physical proximity and mutual grooming that functions in social primates as the behavioral equivalent of conversation. They are aware of you before you step fully into the clearing. Of course they are. Their collective sensory monitoring of the surrounding environment has registered your approach for longer than you realized. And the fact that you are arriving at the edge of their fire rather than being driven away from it is itself a kind of statement, a decision made collectively and without visible deliberation. You are being permitted to approach. You do not know why, and you probably never will. But the permission is real, and you receive it with a gratitude that is entirely disproportionate to the specific warmth of this specific small fire. You settle at the edge of the clearing, not too close, maintaining the spatial positioning that your 2-day education in Pliocene social dynamics has suggested is appropriate for someone of uncertain status in an established group. The fire crackles softly, the smoke drifts in your direction, and your eyes water slightly, and this involuntary physical response produces a sound from one of the younger individuals. Not quite laughter, but something in the register of laughter, brief and light and startling in its familiarity. Here is the thing about that sound. It is the most human thing you have encountered in 2 days in a world without humans, and it lands somewhere in your chest with a warmth that has nothing to do with the fire. Australopithecus afarensis had a brain roughly a third the size of yours. Their vocal anatomy was different from yours in ways that made the kind of language you use impossible for them. Their technology was simple, by any standard you would apply to the word. And yet, sitting at the edge of their fire in the late afternoon of the Pliocene, watching them go about the ordinary business of being alive together, the overwhelming impression is not of difference. It is of continuity, of something recognizable operating at full intensity across an enormous gulf of time. Researchers have not fully agreed on exactly what social and emotional experiences Australopithecus was capable of. The inner life of extinct species is not recoverable from the fossil record in any direct sense, and the temptation to project modern human emotional frameworks onto creatures whose cognitive architecture was genuinely different must be resisted carefully. But the behavioral evidence, the group cohesion, the investment in young, the social complexity, the apparent care for injured or incapacitated individuals, suggested by some fossil specimens showing healed injuries that required survival support, points toward emotional and social lives that were real and rich and mattered to the individuals living them. The surprisingly moving detail in all of this is what it implies about you. You are sitting at this fire because a chain of individuals, each one surviving long enough to reproduce, each one passing something forward, knowledge, behavior, genetic resilience, social capacity, managed to persist across 3 million years of predation and disease and climate change, and all the ordinary catastrophes of biological existence in a difficult world. every single link in that chain held. Not perfectly, not without enormous loss, not without suffering, that the fossil record preserves in bone and tooth as quiet testimony to hard lives. But the chain held, the fire settles, a branch collapsing into coals, with a soft percussion that sends a small fountain of sparks upward into the evening air. The group around it shifts and resettles. Someone makes a sound, and someone else responds. And whatever passes between them in that exchange is lost to you, untranslatable, ancient, carrying freight you cannot access. But the sound of it, the rhythm and warmth of two voices in proximity, is not lost. That, across 3 million years, you recognize completely. The sun is going down again. Your second Pliocene sunset, and you are alive to see it, which by the actuarial standards of this landscape is not nothing. The sky is doing its extraordinary thing again, burning through orange and rose and deep, saturated violet at the horizon. The first stars are beginning, and the Milky Way is gathering itself in the east, preparing its nightly performance for an audience of creatures who do not have a name for it, but who have been watching it from this same landscape for longer than the concept of watching has existed. You are tired. Your body has been through something. The illness your immune system has been quietly managing has settled into a low fever and a heaviness in your limbs that sleep and time and the particular mercy of a physiology built for resilience will eventually resolve. The grass pile you will make tonight will be better than last night's. You know more now. You have learned, in the compressed and uncomfortable way that this landscape teaches, a few things about what it takes to be here. Not enough. Not nearly enough to stay indefinitely, or to thrive in any sustainable sense, or to close the gap between you and the individuals around this fire who carry 3 million additional years of refinement in their bones. But something, a beginning of something. And beginnings, it turns out, are what this whole story has always been about. The fire burns lower. The clearing fills with the blue of deep evening. Around you, the group settles into the arrangements of night, some moving to the trees, some staying close to the coals, the collective intelligence of the group distributing itself across the darkness in the way it has always done, the way it will continue to do for millions of years, until one distant branch of this same social animal sits in lit rooms and reads about the world its ancestors walked through and feels across the impossible distance, something like recognition. The Pliocene night opens above you, vast and starred and ancient, the same sky that has watched everything that has ever happened on this planet, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the smallness of any individual story unfolding beneath it. The grass moves in a late breeze. The coals pulse faintly, orange and warm. Somewhere in the middle distance, the drainage line continues its quiet conversation with the earth. You are 3 million years from home. You are, in the most fundamental sense that the word allows, exactly where you come from. The two facts sit beside each other in the warm dark without contradiction, without resolution, simply true in the way that the oldest things are true, not requiring explanation, not offering comfort exactly, but offering something perhaps more durable than comfort, something like the ground beneath your feet, something like the fire in front of you, something like the unbroken line between that first small hominin stepping into the open grass and the person listening to this story tonight, in whatever warm and sheltered place you have chosen for your rest. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The night deepens. The fire breathes. Let it carry you down now, gently, into the dark and the quiet and the long, dreamless rest that every tired creature, in every era, under every sky, has always needed and always, eventually, found. You made it through the day. They made it through the ages. And somewhere in between those two facts, in the soft space where history becomes personal and the ancient becomes intimate, there is a warmth that no amount of time has ever managed to put out.